I wanted to just welcome you once again to our program this evening for the Your Voice campaign, the webinar series. This time we're talking about Canada and the Middle East, and we'll be introducing our featured speaker, Dr. Besma Momani, in just a moment. So I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Rula Aoude. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations. It's an organization that seeks to promote understanding about the Arab world, the people of the Arab world, and to enhance relations between Canadians and the people of the Arab world. We are located, our head office is located actually in Ottawa, and but we do have members across the country. We have several programs. One is we bring in speakers, well-known speakers, to provide educational seminars. We've had panel discussions, for example, with MPs. We do offer parliamentary interns. This is one of our parliamentary interns who has been working with MPs on the Hill over this few weeks, over the summer, which is an excellent career booster for them and excellent experience. And we also have, if you haven't had a chance to take a look, we have some excellent magazines called Perspectives magazines, which cover opinions and analysis that appear in the international media, in Canadian media. We have one that's focused specifically on security, rights, and freedoms, and also another one on identity politics, because that's been coming up in various political settings. So we encourage you to take a look at those. You'll find them a good way to get a good perspective and to keep up to date. And now I'll pass it on to Raja, who's going to tell us a little bit about the Canadian Arab Institute and the Your Voice campaign.
Hello, everyone. Raja Khouri, the president of the Canadian Arab Institute. In the same way that NCAR is there to talk to other Canadians about the Arab world, the Canadian Arab Institute is here to talk to other Canadians about Canadian Arabs in particular. We are not a known entity, in this country. We are known more by images that are imported from overseas, and our community is often misunderstood, as we all know. So the CI is a think tank that came as an idea 2011, has been fully operational for a little over 2 years, and the idea is to talk to other Canadians, as I said, about the Canadian Arabs, promote their successes, a better understanding of who they are, their heritage, their culture, do research that explores the opportunities and the challenges that they face, as well as provide opportunities for the community to develop itself and become better citizens and better engaged in society. So our vision is about two things. It's about an empowered community, an engaged community, and it's also about a respectful society. So in that sense, we work with the community and with the larger society, and it's to promote Canadian interests by researching and articulating a perspective and potential of Canadian Arabs. So it's very much really about Canadian Arabs, their contributions, and advancing their contributions, making them known. And the way we do that is through three priorities: through research that is directed at policymakers, so that they better understand where the community is coming from, what are its challenges and opportunities; through education directed at the Canadian public in general; and through community engagement directed at our own community, so that we are better engaged in the life of the country. So Your Voice is very much within the last priority of engagement, and the need for this campaign, which was really to get people to realize the importance of participating in the democratic process and becoming engaged citizens. And voting is the first step. It's not the last step, not by any means, but certainly it's the first step to becoming engaged. And if you don't vote, then you're really not part of the conversation. You're not part of shaping the society that we live in and its future. So we came up with this campaign, and we're working with a number of organizations like NCAR, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, the Arab Community Center of Toronto, and many others in other cities to send that message out. And the way we've been doing that is through this kind of webinar, which brings to the fore an issue that is important to us, immigration and citizenship, and bring awareness about how this issue has been developing over the years and where the different parties stand on it today, so that people are better informed when they go to the polls on October 19th. So we've been going to events to talk to people there. We've had panels. We've got all kinds of activities happening, a contest. We launched something recently called a feature called Arab Faces of Canada, to talk about, these are the people in the community. And some of you might have seen the Arabic version of O Canada that we launched just before Canada Day, and has been tremendously successful. It was to bring attention to the fact that there is a campaign going on, that we are citizens, that we have a duty, that we should be engaged. It's really a pleasure to introduce Dr. Momani, a good friend, a colleague, and someone who has been part of the Canadian Institute from its inception. She is a prolific writer, academic, researcher. She's an associate professor at the University of Waterloo and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She's a senior fellow of the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institutions in Washington, D.C. She has authored and co-edited over 6 books and over 55 scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. I think that number is outdated, Basma. I think there's more now. This bio I have here, I think, needs to be updated a little bit. She has written chapters that have examined the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, petrodollars, regional trade agreements in the Middle East, economic liberalization throughout the Gulf and the Middle East, the Arab Gulf. Many of you have seen her on television, heard her on the radio, CBC, CTV, The National, Al Jazeera English, Bloomberg, and so on. She's been a sought after commentator on things Middle East, and of course things Middle East these days are many, and it's been a real pleasure to work with Basma, and she's on our board of directors of the Canadian Arab Institute. And none of this really pays justice to her accomplishments, and I look forward as much as the rest of you to hear her presentation tonight.
Well, thank you, Rola and Raja, for those kind words, especially. Now I feel like I should have had a bigger presentation, but I'm not gonna. I was really just hoping to talk about some issues and answer questions. I'm gonna maybe focus on some issues that I think are in the media limelight today, like the Syrian refugee crisis. Where do the different parties stand? We'll talk about the fight against ISIS. And I'm not a Canadian political scientist, or I should say I'm a Canadian political scientist, but I'm not a political scientist that specializes on Canada. And even though one feels that you learn this through osmosis, but my expertise is much more on the political economy side of things and on Middle East affairs. So I try to track as much as I can with what's going on from the Canadian dimension, but there was an old saying about Canadian politics. It was one of the classes you could easily fall asleep in as a student, and so I really kind of stayed away from studying it. And now I feel bad because I think I should have gotten a little more up to speed on what's going on with them. But anyhow, it's interesting times, of course. During election, it becomes more intriguing. So just to kind of highlight, I don't think it needs to be pointed out that there has clearly been some slippage in the fact that the Canadian government under Harper has committed itself to saying that it would take 10,000 refugees. It went as high as 20,000, but we continue to not see an actual appearance of refugees in Canada. And in fact, the number of refugees in Canada is still undetermined. Chris Alexander has yet to respond to exactly how many. There is an inflated number, I believe, of 1,200 being circulated around by the government, but much of those are not coming through the refugee program. Much of them are coming by virtue of showing up in Canada somehow or another and then claiming refugee status once get here. And of course, yes, they are often approved. Very few of those who show up on our shores or in our airports are turned away as refugees. In fact, I can tell anecdotally that that's very much a successful way of getting the refugee status here in Canada. However, what a refugee resettlement policy ought to be, and the way it works, is that you get credentialed by the United Nations as being a refugee, which is important because it distinguishes one from being an economic migrant, which is not, frankly, under international law, yet to be considered an acceptable, or let's put it this way, legitimate, and I use that very broadly. I apologize. It's condescending because it's, of course, it's legitimate, but it's not legitimate in the legal sense of the word to be considered a refugee. And important to point out that Canada is a signatory to the UN refugee. I'm forgetting the name of the claim or the tenant, but a UN law that says that we will be a place that if a refugee is deemed to be a refugee, we will house and take care of them. Just in contrast to that, to put this into perspective, much of the Arab Gulf countries have not signed on to the UN Refugee Convention, which is that they do not believe that they have a moral obligation to accept refugees that show up at their shores. Obviously, for some of the Middle East Gulf countries, which have very generous welfare policies, etc., and being much of its locals being a minority, you can see why they don't want to be signatories to that, even though many of us could criticize that on a moral grounds. So what this means is the government has said it must go through the UN. Now, this seems to feel like a lot of delay tactics being used. And one of the processes involved is getting certain papers to the UN agencies. Now, if you're in Syria, that means you have to leave the country. So it doesn't privilege those who are internally displaced. You really have to leave the country and say that you're a refugee to the United Nations and be processed as such. Lebanon does not have refugee camps. And so what that means is not everybody, or there's no sort of, although there are a lot of them that are UN documented refugees, as far as the UN is concerned, receive some benefits for being a UN refugee, it does make it a lot more difficult to sort of manage. Turkey similarly does not have refugee camps that are funded by the UN. They do have their own Red Cross, Turkish Red Cross supported refugee camps. Jordan does have a UN refugee camp. And so in that sense, it's probably the easiest in order to get refugees out, just because they're there, they're housed, one can find them in an easier space and time. This is all to point out that the commitment to taking 20,000 that we've heard Chris Alexander, many of us heard him first announce, for example, at the Canadian Arab Institute Gala a few years ago, say that was welcomed news by so many, including members of the Canadian Arab community, obviously. But the challenge has been that we have not seen individuals come through the refugees process, let's say. In fact, today, I should say yesterday, the CBC reported that currently there are 9 cases, only 9 cases of Syrian refugees that are approved in that so-called basket of UN refugees ready to come to Canada that Canada has agreed to take. So you can see the numbers are absolutely appalling. Moreover, those particular 9 cases still mean they're many, many months away from coming. Now, the UN process is meant to distinguish refugees who need to seek asylum because they're persecuted, and also differentiate them from economic migrants, as I said. That obviously you may have heard has led to a wider debate in the media about, do we call um, the, 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 the throngs of people that we see in our media uh, um, pages of newspapers and broadcast TV, are they refugees or migrants? There's a real serious legal implication to calling them refugees, and so you can see why they have a preference for calling them migrants. If I may, I apologize. I know I'm not saying enough about Canadian politics, so that's partly because, again, it's not my specialty, but I'll weave it back in, I promise. But I think its context is really helpful here, at least I hope. And one of the things that I should say about the refugee process as well is that the refugee process also takes care of things like security screenings. It also makes sure that indeed they are persecuted. And if we look at the migrant or refugee crisis that's emanating out of particularly Syria and Iraq, we do see some economic migrants. And so they may not be the most persecuted. And again, that's a really hard, fuzzy concept. I mean, how do you guarantee what is the most persecuted of anyone? The conservative government has, for about 6 months now, really tried to put a categorization of what is the most persecuted. And particularly after the crisis of the persecution against the Yazidi minority in Iraq, the government was quick to point out that it is religious minorities that are the most vulnerable and the most persecuted. This has caused an uproar within the bureaucracy because it is really selective and suggesting that only religious minorities, and in the case of the Yazidis, there is absolute unbelievable genocide going on. But that doesn't necessarily translate to the whole situation. To give context to that as well, in Iraq, for example, it is much more the religious minorities who are the most persecuted. The Yazidis, the Christians are far more persecuted than, say, the Sunnis and the Shias. In the case of Syria, you could argue that, in fact, if we look at where refugees come from, the last number I heard from a talk that I was privy to by the UN Refugee Agency was that 95% of the refugees were Sunni Muslim. So it's not a clear-cut religious distinction, and even that I think is not a fair place to start. One should really scrutinize every application for its merits and understand why is a refugee claiming such status, and what are the potential persecution that they may be experiencing. So this is all to say that I think the government has been very slow at processing a lot of this. They have been trying to push an agenda of having only religious minorities leave Syria. I think they've received a bit of pushback at the bureaucratic level. I can't prove that, although this is a lot of conversations that I've had with bureaucrats who are quite frustrated. And I can say that there's been a number of, one of which that I testified at, Senate committees on foreign relations, whereby it was very much framed in that discussion. And a lot of the conversation that was had and asked of me was to give them a clear answer as to whether or not it is true that it's a religious minority, one or two that we could point to so that we could quickly, I think, process some of these refugee applicants. And as you can tell from my comments, I think that wasn't something that I believed in, and so I cautioned against that. In the case of where we are today, the processing time of a Syrian refugee is about 55 months. Again, quite appalling. This has been, I think, highlighted most adequately by the uncle of Aylan Kurdi, the young boy that was found dead on the beach shores of Turkey. And his uncle said in NPR, National Public Radio in the US, a few days ago, an interview, and I quote, "The process is designed to fail." So that, I think, says a lot about the existing processing system. It is one that we've heard, obviously, in the past week with a great deal of media and public attention and care about the refugee crisis. We've seen some commentary. Justin Trudeau has asked to have us accept 25,000 refugees, also saying to stop dragging their feet to the government. The NDP has insisted and said Mulcair has talked about processing 10,000 Syrian refugees before the end of this year, so giving it a very clear time target. And again, although we know from the Conservatives' proposal of increasing to 10,000, they have expanded that to not just Syrians, but Iraqis. And I think that's really important because it fits the narrative in Iraq that, and it fits what has been a consistent attempt by the Conservative and Harper government to ensure that it is only Christian Iraqis that are admitted under refugee policy. So when you hear the current government speak of refugees, they are talking about it often applying to Syrians and Iraqis for that purpose. I've been shocked, although I think for some of us who have been beating on the doors of the government consistently for years now, that this is not a crisis that's going away. I myself have testified to this, spoken to policymakers that, you know, Syria, the challenge has been that for too long, the West keeps hoping it'll just implode. In other words, it'll just contain itself within. And I've always been warning that, you know, it's morally wrong to say that we just want it to implode and not think about the Syrians caught within Syria. But more importantly, as a political analyst, that it's not just going to implode, it will explode. And it's not just a matter of the neighbors, which is making their situation quite tenuous in the region, but it will reach our shores. And I think many of us who are trying to put this in context for people, I remember very early on saying, you know, when the refugees were at the million, I said, you know, for the Assad regime, which I'm sorry, I can't really hold back any, be polite about it. You know, for the Assad regime, he's very happy for 21 million to go. And so, you know, this is not going to stop. He's quite content on continuing the last Syrian leaves the country. He has nothing to lose. The more of his opponents that leave, the better. And so we can see a clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying the word of ethnic cleansing. I think he's been trying to do ethnic cleansing from beginning, and we're seeing that come to the shores of Europe. Now, one of the things that I'll say is that actually, one of the things that we see from the current migration pattern is actually they are the second wave because many of them have a little bit of money. So the ones that first left were the most desperate, and often had, you know, well, the ultra wealthy left and opted to go to much of Europe and the Gulf countries, fine. But then you also had the exodus of those literally by foot, many of those that we saw crossing into Jordan, into Lebanon, and Turkey. But the ones that we are looking at today are the ones that have a little bit of cash to muster up, right? And are saying, you know what, if I have $5,000, it's about that price, between $3,000 to $5,000, I will use that and get myself on a raft to take a plane ride to Istanbul if I have to, or find some way to the border and take the raft, pay the smuggler, make my way to Europe. It's not, and I don't want to put hierarchy, so I apologize if it sounds that way. It really does, and I apologize. It's not meant to be. But my point is that, you know, the refugee crisis is coming in waves, and this is a wave of, you could call it the, you know, the lower middle class wave that is leaving now. And that just to point out that there's more to come. You know, we're not seeing the tip of the, we're just seeing, I should say, the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more to come. And I think that if we look at Aleppo, if we look at parts of Damascus, once we start seeing the middle class proper start leaving, you know, that's when you know it's uncontrollable, because They will find their way to all across the world, and we will be in the scenario of not the 800,000 that we talk about as a big number going to Germany, which represents 1% of its population, but we'll be talking about the exodus of 3 to 4 million people. So I think this is starting to make sense. It is, I think, very shameful that the West is finally waking up only when it hits European soil. I think the image of Alian Kurdi did a lot. And I have to say, Allah yarhamu, I don't think he died in vain, because he really shook the world's consciousness. Some of us who have been seeing horrific images from Syria, no less horrific than Alian, are shocked that what about the number of babies that I saw coming out of rubble in Aleppo? I thought that would do it, just why that particular image? Perhaps because people could sympathize. I heard that quite a bit. Wearing his little blue shorts, his Velcro shoes. I mean, it finally hit the consciousness of the Western audience in such a way. And we know that the Canadian government, or I should say the Conservatives in particular, did a very bad job initially of handling that, specifically Chris Alexander, and that's cost them, I think, quite a bit of empathy or lack. Their showing of lack of empathy really struck a chord in Canadians. I do think it'll be not a complete swing issue. I mean, that with the economy, so to bring this back to sort of an issue that has a lot of resonance among Canadian voters, is, I think, putting a chink in the armor of the Conservative Party, and I think it does fill that image, whether it's real or perceived, that somehow they're quite cold. They're not the kind of fuzzy, liberal, warm Canadians that we are so used to. Harper's avoidance of the UN, Harper's dislike for multilateralism, all the other principles that have kind of given a negative tone or image of the Conservative Party are kind of crystallized in the lack of empathy over Alian Kurdi's image, specifically by Chris Alexander. It took a while for Harper to say something, but we sort of always expect him to be frigid, and he's the one that shook the hand of his own son on the first day of school, right? So we kind of got used to that, but it just says a lot about the entire party. And maybe that's not fair, but I'm sure there are many conservatives who were touched by that. But that's nevertheless, I think, become a very interesting, decisive issue. And it doesn't happen very often that foreign policy moves Canadians one way or another. And speaking of which, most Canadians don't vote on foreign policy issues. That is consistently shown to be the case. And so it's quite, it would be quite novel if this is something that will make the Canadian government, I think, wake up, or the Canadian Conservative Party wake up. I just want to add one thing. The other thing too, I think that this crystallized, whether it was the coldness, but also this idea of staying on message. I mean, people are quite frustrated, and I think they should be, by the reality that we've seen a lot of rhetoric about taking 20,000, but really, I think we're talking about maybe 200-300 have actually been admitted under the refugee program, not the ones that showed up at our shores. Remember, taken from the UN and a resettlement policy, and they keep throwing the same line over and over again. We're taking 20,000, up to 50,000 if you include the Iraqis, and yada yada, and then talking about this as being a war against ISIS as a way to prevent refugees. The Harper himself saying something ridiculous like, you can't solve a refugee crisis with a refugee policy. That doesn't make sense. So I think it's damaged the party in that respect. Both going back to our agenda item of how the other parties look at this, the Liberals and the NDP have both been, I think, really picking on this point of immediate, quick, saying the same numbers though, 20,000. We know that the Americans also committed to taking 20,000. Just today, or I should say the White House said they'll take 10,000, which is really quite small. We could take a lot more as well if we want to be specific about that. But nevertheless, that's where we stand.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to Nadia's question about, and she echoes many Canadians who are been asking the same thing. What can we do? I mean, the image of Alian, as Basma mentioned, had this, magic mix of conditions in it that it provoked this kind of welcome reaction that is long time coming. I mean, we've been seeing all kinds of images, but it's happening now, and people have woken up, and they're paying attention that there's a huge issue here. The Canadian Arab Institute was one of the founding members of a group in Toronto, based out of Toronto, called Lifeline Syria, and you can find them online. Lifeline Syria started out as a citizens group wanting to motivate, encourage, and support potential sponsors of immigrants through the private sponsorship stream of refugee relocation. Canada had committed to 10,000 over 3 years, and it's generally understood that 40% of the 10,000 would be sponsored by the government, and about 60% will be sponsored by through private sponsorships. So these private sponsorships are two kinds of sponsorships. One is organizations, they're called sponsorship agreement holders. And these are organizations like church groups and other charity organizations who are whose job is to sponsor refugees from all parts of the world. And that's what they do. And then there are the regular citizens who, like you and I, who can come together in groups of 5 or more and say, we will sponsor a refugee or a refugee family together. And that, is a sum of money that's around $27,000 to $30,000 that will basically sustain the life of a refugee family of 4 over the first year of their uh, living in Canada. So going back to, the Lifeline Syria has been getting enormous response from regular Canadian citizens who are saying, yes, we want to help. And the range of helping could be a simple donation, or it could be, coming together as a group of 5 or more to say we will sponsor a family or one person even. And Lifeline Syria will sort of guide these people through the process of sponsorship, because it's a tedious process. There's 30-page form to fill out. There's all kinds of ins and it's very heavy red tape process. So that's why we figured people will need the support of this kind of organization. And happily, this organization has received now $300,000 funding from the province of Ontario to so that they can hire some staff so they can actually support the sponsoring families. Now, all of this will come to naught if the policy doesn't change. Because right now, the policy is very cumbersome. As Besma mentioned, it can take months and years. It is exceedingly slow, red tape, not enough staff, and it's just not going to happen. The numbers will continue to trickle the way they have been over the last 2 years, unless the policy changes. And the pressure is on the government to make that change in policy. And today, Harper, for the first time, hinted, we'll have to see, the Prime Minister hinted that they might be, doing something to try and expedite the process.
I'll just quickly go over the fight against ISIS and what that means. So far, the Conservative Party, I think, will be continuing where it left off, which has been pursuing the idea of taking this fight to ISIS itself. Canada so far committed not a great deal in relative terms. I think we talk a lot about about what we've done, but I think keep in mind it really is primarily an American-led mission. We do have 6 fighter planes, a refueling plane, service aircraft, 600 military personnel, 69 special forces who serve in advisory capacity. We have been particularly helping the Kurdish Peshmerga, that's when most of our effort has been. We know that 1 Canadian soldier has been killed, probably in a friendly fire situation. When we're talking about this, it looks like the Liberals will be arguing to keep the same. probably try to focus more on the training, less in terms of hardware. And so again, we don't have a lot of planes that are involved in this. As I said, most of the real heavy work is being done by the Americans when it comes to the aerial bombardment. In terms of the NDP, we've heard recently Mulcair say that there would be an immediate withdrawal of all Canadian forces. Again, that's about 600 military personnel, 69 special forces that would be immediately withdrawn. Now, in terms of where others have sort of put this into context, the Harper has, and the Conservative government has argued that part of the way that they've responded to the refugee crisis is by stopping ISIS. I'll just point out that, again, ISIS is responsible for only a fraction of the entire death toll of the Syrian crisis. And so it's still not clear how that link is being made. The Liberals said that they would, again, increase more Canadian soldiers in training. They do want to continue to support the Kurdish Peshmerga. But keeping in mind that even that, as a Middle East analyst, I point out that the Kurdish Peshmerga have taken on a defensive role at this point. They are no longer interested in offensive role. So what that means is, although they are done a fine job of preventing and liberating some areas out of ISIS control, they are still absolutely not interested in going past their own green line, self-imposed green line, and acquire and liberate other territories, specifically Mosul, which is most closest to them, because they want to create the parameters for a future state, I believe, in Iraq. So that does mean that it's a little unclear, how long that's going, or what's the purpose of sending more Canadian training. The one training that I think needs to be required, again, is, sorry to drift here rather than giving you more on the Canadian perspective, but what needs to be added is Iraqi military training, which has been mostly done by the Americans, and I think that actually the Canadians do have a comparative advantage in getting involved in training the Iraqi military, specifically to create a military that's a professional force and one that's not led by sectarian interests, as is currently the case in the Iraqi government or the Iraqi military. Other than that, we don't really have much more in terms of how they would pursue fighting ISIS. Some of it on the grounds of countering violent extremism here in Canada, i.e. preventing foreign fighters, making sure that we stop radicalization in communities is something that would likely be something that the NDP and perhaps the Liberals would support and fund more. I'll point out that the under the Harper government, there was an ambitious project to do something to that effect, but it has run out of money and there's no more refunding it. And that has meant that there's less opportunity, I think, to really do positive de-radicalization or preventative radicalization strategies, what is broadly subsumed under this countering violent extremism. And so it's, if you sort of believe that part of it is not just fighting ISIS, but also militarily, I should say, but also ideologically, then you might be interested in both the NDP and the Liberal parties' commitment to wanting to do something greater on that front and from a funding perspective. The government has not favored. Currently, there's a somewhat of a disdain for that kind of sort of de-radicalization or preventative radicalization strategies. They're much more liberal in, let's say, European countries, which have done a lot of good work on that. And I just want to point out, because I'm currently trying to do some of this in my own research, and I know this is not the subject of concern, but with Bill C-51, it actually makes it quite difficult to even have conversations about these issues. So there's also another, I think, potential problem with that. I know you guys had a discussion about, or there is going to be an upcoming one, but to be specific on the C-51, C-51 under the Harper administration, I think, has potentially muzzled a lot of the kinds of programs and initiatives that would have been used for something like a de-radicalization strategy or countering violent extremism. Sorry for using those wordings, but that's kind of the nomenclature that is in the literature and used by policy speak. But I don't want to sound like a policy wonk, even though I do. But if you look at the NDP, they've said they would repeal C-51 automatically. And the Liberals said that they would keep parts of it and alter some of them. And hopefully that the alterations that they would bring in could be the kinds that allow a more, I'm trying to think of the right word. I can't find anything other than liberal, but it's not capital L, small l, liberal way of thinking about countering violent extremism strategies, because under C-51, it makes it very difficult to even talk to people about why and how to prevent that. There is some novel work being done on stopping ISIS online. We haven't been on the forefront of that, but that is something that also would be very useful in a CVE strategy that, again, the current government under C-51 doesn't even make it easy for community leaders, community service providers, organizations to talk about these things. Otherwise, they would be potentially under a C-51 deemed to be accessories to a potential and forthcoming crime. So it is complicated, without a doubt, but happy to talk about the fight against ISIS. In the Q&A, I'll just add one last thing. My take on fighting ISIS is a multi-pronged approach, that there is a need for a military strategy with very careful aerial bombardment, with the challenge being that, in fact, we've seen the number of targets that are clear kind of dwindling because there's only so much that can be done from an aerial bombardment. Not only do you need really good on-the-ground surveillance, which is very difficult to do in territory that is being ruled with the iron fist and draconian way that ISIS operates, but also there is some local sympathy for ISIS. And as we've seen already, the Canadian bombing may have attributed to 27 civilian deaths in ISIS territory. Then what that may do is also create a blowback effect whereby we can't get the kind of intelligence on the ground. So there's no easy military solution to this. Some of it needs to be on an ideological warfare. Others might point out, I think rightly so, that one needs to fight the Assad regime's propensity of violence to change the political landscape of what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Iraq. Two governments that I think have had a disastrous policy vis-a-vis their own citizens. And so that may, in the future, quell ISIS. And there are others who will point out that ISIS is here to stay for some time, and that it's a matter of containing and not beating ISIS. And it's going to continue to be sort of that multi-pronged approach. So I hope that answered some of the issues or concerns that people have, but I'd much rather hear questions and specify an answer to that. Yeah, I wish I had an answer for how much this costs. I don't know. I would think that eventually those numbers would need to be, it will be in the public sphere. It may already be. Again, we're not absorbing most of the cost. Much of it is American-led. But of course, there is some cost to our involvement. And there is a number out there floating. I forgot the number completely, but I can tell you that one of the interesting comparisons I did see was that fighting ISIS versus a countering violent extremism strategy, a CVE strategy is a much cheaper strategy than trying to fight ISIS. So perhaps we need to be more preventative is a better policy approach. But I don't have the answer to that. And then in terms of whether or not fighting ISIS is a delay tactic, I think it's useful to say that, because Harper's made the link, it's not one that you have to force upon anyone, that there is a conservative argument that by fighting ISIS, it is preventing, well, his argument has been that fighting ISIS will, in a sense, ease the refugee crisis. Again, I don't find a lot of merit to that argument, only because most of the refugees are leaving actually the Assad regime. That's not to say that there isn't an exodus of ethnic minorities and religious minorities, particularly in Iraq, but in Syria, we don't nearly see the same numbers and scale. And that's partly because ISIS governs or lays claim to controlling territory that is generally not highly populated compared to the central parts of Syria and Iraq, which are much more dense. So that could also explain that. But again, it's not a convincing argument, and I think that the numbers on the death count and refugee flows would easily support that.
I Googled the cost, and I found a CTV story from April of this year saying that it's anticipated to be $500 million over a year, the cost of Canada's involvement in the war against ISIS. Just wanted to add that.
That has not tended to be on any political party's platform. We technically have all three political parties committing to a two-state solution. I think there have been some who doubt the sincerity of Harper and the Conservative Party's views on actually seeing the fruition of a Palestinian state coming to the fore. Both the Liberal and the NDP have stayed in line with Canada's longstanding policy, although officially, again, I have to keep in mind that the Conservatives have not changed. Literally on the website, it says the same statement that we've had for 15 years, even longer since the Oslo Accord. So that hasn't changed, but we clearly see a big change in our voting pattern at the United Nations under the Harper government, and also in the attitude towards Palestinian leadership and on funding of Palestinian causes. So one could clearly point out there is a differential there, although again, it's quite interesting that technically the government, the current government claims that it is also in line with the two-state solution. That obviously is an issue that none of the political parties want to address as a policy or as a foreign policy platform. But yeah, that's where I would say the three stand at the moment. Well, the military does have to be a component of it. I think that we need to make sure that, and I can tell you from some of the Pentagon's, some papers that have been released by the Pentagon, including quite a number of very good journalistic studies, have shown that under the Obama administration, they have been trying to be extremely careful in the aerial bombardment. And that this is actually, despite the advice of a lot of generals who are gun happy and really want to go into some areas. And so that, I think is a good thing. We need to be absolutely certain what we're hitting and target. But the point is we're running out of targets. We hit their communication infrastructure. We hit some of the oil refineries to prevent them from getting access to funds. We hit what we thought were their centers of control. At this point, when you're talking about, it's not quite a state, it's a quasi-insurgency. They're very much integrated with civilian populations. So to try and root them out in some way that doesn't kill civilians is extremely hard. Like I said, if we don't have the kind of intelligence on the ground, which we are increasingly finding less and less. Also, the entire Western military forces are very gun shy about putting military planes or I should say pilots in the sky. They're much happy to use drone technology, which is again highly dependent on more so dependent on surveillance on the ground than even a manned aircraft. So there's no easy military solution. I do believe that there's a great deal of room for training. And right now, again, we focused a lot on the Peshmerga, which is great as a defensive line against ISIS, but we have done not nearly enough and we can do a lot more in helping the Iraqi government become a professional army. Again, we come from a multicultural society where our Canadian forces come from across various ethnic backgrounds. And what we could do is bring more of that kind of, I think, spirit with us in training the Iraqi military to be a more, I think, nationalistic force rather than a sectarian force as it's been. So there's a lot of work to be done on the Iraqi side of things. The finances of ISIS continue to still be emboldened. Um, there's a lot of misconception about where ISIS gets its money. Some of it is from oil, but increasingly, and what continues to be the main source of funding is actually through ransom. And that is a real challenge because a lot of journalists, freelancers who are going into the region are being kidnapped. We see aid workers. We see, good-hearted souls like Mueller and others go into these zones and get kidnapped. And unfortunately, there is a market now for not just even Western individuals, but people like there's an Assyrian man in Iraq, or I should say in Saskatoon, whose family has been kidnapped by ISIS, Syrian, and they have been paying to keep the family alive. So that kind of unfortunate situation where there has been a lot of ransom money given to ISIS. And it's a huge moral dilemma. If it was our family members, we'd do everything that we could to pay it. But you do create a marketplace, sadly, when you start paying ransom. And so that's something that needs to be stopped. In terms of the ideology, there's been a lot of dissection of where does the ISIS ideology come from? Can religious scholars do more? I think there's a lot that can be done to combat ISIS from within. Some of that would have to involve some uncomfortable conversations within some of the Salafist Muslim community that are potentially peaceful. This is the sad part, is that some of the comment in the media has been, and I should say in the think tank world has been, what's really different between a Wahhabi Salafist and a jihadi Salafist of ISIS. And there's not a lot in terms of day-to-day practice, but in the sort of succumbing to political will and this idea of a jihad is very much specifically held by the jihadi Salafists. So can we use, for example, some of those Salafists to be interlocutors? There's also an argument that ISIS, through its recruitment, one way to stop this is really preventing the recruitment. Just so we know, we have 100 Canadians who we know who have purportedly gone to Syria or Iraq to fight on behalf of ISIS. The largest number continues to come from Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, a lot of countries that are quite odd. I mean, Belgium has the highest if you go by per capita. So there's an interesting also pattern of where they come from and what may lead a disaffected youth. We know they're primarily youth to go join ISIS would be very different than, say, perhaps what a Saudi youth will join. So, understanding the dynamics of the recruitment are very different from country to country, and we need to have context. Something that I'd like to study here in Canada, but I'm just pointing out with C51 is almost impossible to study without getting into hot water as a researcher. So that's something we got to fix. But we've seen different programs. The Saudis have a very interesting program on preventing radicalization. It's called Marriage. The number one way they've been able to prevent these young disaffected men from returning, after they're being arrested from having fought with ISIS, they bring them back to Saudi Arabia, they marry them, they give them a home. Once they have kids, they have a 95% retention rate. And that's actually considered, in the de-radicalization policy world, it's considered a very successful strategy. I'm not saying that's the solution to everything, but understanding where the youth disaffection comes from. Some of the research is split on this. Political scientists tend to think it's a political problem, that there is a political narrative, that there's disaffected youth that are joining because of Western foreign policies. Sociologists would argue that it's a new social movement, it's a cult, and they're attracted to ISIS because it provides this purification model. they tend to, and we see some fantastic reports of this on the New York Times, where they're reaching out to middle America youth, and ISIS and their operatives basically befriend young, vulnerable people with no religious persuasion, and slowly, kind of lure them in with this narrative of purification. So again, it's multifaceted. There's no one easy solution to explaining how and why ISIS is able to recruit, but one argument to combat ISIS is to prevent the radicalization and to deal with also, I mean, what we're, this is something that I wrote an op-ed on, but, a lot of youth that are attracted to ISIS do go there and figure out that they're completely un-Islamic, target more Muslims than non-Muslims, and figure out very quickly that it's all hypocrisy. But we don't have an integration system. What do we do when they come back? We've seen reports of European and North American kids who call their parents once they get there and say, okay, this is insane. I made a mistake. What do I do? This poor British family that worked desperately to get their son back, and now that son is in prison. And we actually don't have a mechanism for reintegration, and so we end up kind of making this a one-way process. I think we should be using those returnees effectively to help de-radicalize a future generation of those who want to go back and fight.
I just wanted to, for this part of the webinar, thank you very much, Dr. Momani, for a very interesting and informative overview of Canada's policies by the various parties. I'm sure it'll help a lot of us as we gather information and decide how we're going to vote and how we're going to engage in the democratic process moving forward. I encourage everyone to go to our websites, which are listed here. Check out the Your Voice campaign, lots of good resources and good ways to get involved. Definitely check out our magazines, where we actually have a media team collecting all of these latest reports and latest analyses and commentaries on a daily basis, so you'll be completely up to date if you're able to follow us on that. With that, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Reja and Dr. Momani, for being part of our session tonight.